All right, let's go ahead and get going. So, hello, welcome everyone to the first, maybe inaugural, I mean, who knows, of the Shadow Word podcast. This is something that the Warcraft pre-space has done in years past with Twin Top, so big shout out to him if he ever watches this. We're trying to start it again. Who knows if we'll do more of these? I would like to. So, if you guys are enjoying the podcast and you think this is fun, let me know, and we'll do more. Today we have a bunch of guests from the Warcraft Priest Discord team. So you have myself, and I'll let everyone kind of introduce themselves. So if you don't know me, hello, my name's Publik. Been working on Shadow Priest since about Legion, doing all kinds of guide writing for Icy Veins, Warcraft Priest stuff, and then one of the SimC guys as well. So I'll kind of let everyone introduce themselves. We'll go ahead and start off with Saeldur.
Hello, I'm Saeldur. I do SimC work and the APL for Shadow Priest primarily.
Cool. And we have Jearv with him as well, another APL genius.
I'm Jearv.
There you go. That's Jearv.
Method Raider, Jearv.
Yeah, that guy. Ellipsis.
Hi, I'm Ellipsis. I've been doing Shadow Priest theory crafting and general community face being since about Legion. I am currently the Wowhead guide writer for Shadow Priest.
There you go. And last but not least, we have Jereico, who's new to the team. Welcome.
Thanks, Bob. Yep, so I'm Steve, aka Jereico. I've also basically been Mythic raiding on Shadows since Legion. The whole Surrender to Madness nonsense really got me hooked, and I've been really involved in the Warcraft community, or the Warcraft Priest community, since then. Not a Wowhead or Icy writer, but, I've written a couple of small guides for the Shadow community, and I've been doing a lot of kind of videos and guide writing for the beta cycle, but I'm for Evoker a little more than Shadows. So yeah, you can find my stuff, my socials there. So good stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, are all of us Legion babies? I don't know. How many of us have played Shadow like as their main before Legion? It's just a few of you, right?
I've been maining Shadow since TBC pretty much.
TBC, okay.
I mainly PvP'd before Legion. Like again, like Surrender to Madness was probably the biggest thing that pushed me towards like actually raiding on Shadow.
Yeah.
And then I quickly got, not say tired of it, but like it became less interesting, and I kind of just started to just more enjoy regular raiding. But I'd raided before with the people I'd PvP'd with in the past, and like, I don't know, I've been playing with Spec for a very, very long time at this point.
Yeah, I love, you can measure how long you've played Shadow based on how many reworks you've played of it.
I've played every single new talent every single quote unquote new talent that appeared in the talent tree. I played when it was live.
There you go. See.
So.
Awesome. So let's kind of dig into it. So, starting off, we have pre-patch coming out for Dragonflight probably in a few weeks. There's still no date, right? I'm not crazy.
Yeah,
not
there's no
announced yet.
pre-patch date.
Okay, date TBD. Probably end of the month, something like that. And then the actual expansion comes out the end of November. So we're like kind of at the point now where the way the spec is playing in beta is probably pretty close to how it's going to be on live. Obviously, pre-patch coming out is not going to be quite the same. Just, you won't have access to all of your talents. I think you're missing like what, 6, 7 talent points, something like that.
Yeah, around that.
It'd be 5 in the class.
Okay, just 5. Okay, so you're 5 less talent points than you'll have at 70 in pre-patch, and then Lord knows what kind of cursed combinations will run in pre-patch. But in general, things are somewhat cementing themselves. I know for those of you that haven't seen it, myself and others have put quite a bit of time on the forums just saying like how Shadow's playing right now and why it's not perfect is the nicest way to put it. But to kind of start us off, let's just talk about Shadow right now as it plays in a raiding environment and just kind of say how we feel about it there. Anyone want to fancy kicking us off about Shadow Priest and raids? I know some of us have done raid testing on it. I can start if no one wants to.
I mean, my experience with it has been if you deliberately play every single interactive talent possible and have like 33% haste at least, you can get a playable, comfortable feeling rotation out of it. Once you remove any of those factors, you start falling asleep pressing Mind Flare or Mind Spike.
Yeah, the Mind Spike spam is it's something. I think I feel like it's playable in raid though. Like I think if you don't look at the just not looking at the damage meter, I think there is some stuff that at least it's not like the worst thing in the world, right?
On a single target raid encounter.
Yeah.
With a non-ridiculous spider boss level of movement.
Yeah.
It is a somewhat comfortable spec to play if you pick every single interactive talent, regardless of how much damage they do.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask, especially because most of my time on the beta for Shadow has been really just dummy hitting. Haven't had a lot of time to test, and I did get the sense that while it's not so much my cup of tea, what they've sort of changed and added, with the Mind Spike interactions and that kind of thing, it's not really for me. But if I had to, I could learn to love it. What I did notice in raid testing in general is that there are a lot of ad-focused encounters, movement-focused encounters, a lot of stuff that traditionally Shadow might, struggle to keep up with. I guess I'm kind of curious to know how that affected you guys in raid testing as well. If single target sounds good, but maybe maybe some rough edges around some of the other fight styles.
Yeah, it felt like ideal scenario single target was decent in terms of playstyle, but the damage was neither here nor there. And then once you deviated from like either your own build or how the fight encounter played out, it just got worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and I think there's just like the build your own Shadow Priest concept that they've coined on the forums. I think just doesn't quite work out in practice. So a lot of I think the raiding stuff is just going to depend on a little bit of just like what's meta, or like what does the most damage. Like the one thing I was really looking for in the tree that's not there is being like, oh, this is a council fight, or oh, this is a heavy movement fight, or it's a spread target cleave kind of a thing. I want to pick these talents for that situation, and I haven't really gotten that personally.
Yeah, I never feel like my talent tree is giving me the tools to handle an encounter. Really.
In the past, at least you might go, okay, I'll take Misery on this fight instead of Toph because I know I'm going to have to target swap every once in a while, or maybe I'll take Crash because I know there's going to be some stack cleave, right? I get the sense I agree with you guys that I don't see necessarily a lot of room to tilt towards specific fight types here.
It's also because the tree is so spread out among trying to do different thematic things and not necessarily different rotational things that you end up picking stuff that makes sense in AoE in single target because there isn't another talent on the tree that makes any sense with the build already. Like you play Shadow Crash on single target because it's the best button to pick out of the things you can choose. So you don't have this, there's ads on this fight, I'll pick Shadow Crash. You just already have it because you don't have a better option.
Yeah, or like it's single target. I'm definitely going to pick Void Torrent, for sure. But then the thing after Void Torrent is N'Zoth and AoE, like an AoE idol, right? So then pathing over there might not may even make sense.
It's just very all over the place, and you don't really feel like you're building towards anything specific.
Yeah.
Jearv, given you must have done a lot more thorough raid testing than all of us, so do you have an opinion on any of this?
Yeah, it's pretty spot on.
Fair enough. It's just very like.
I think the tools are there. I mean, I think, and I put this out in the recent forum post, but I think that there are tools there that they could do. I think it's just kind of a question of tuning. Like in the recent raid testing, I think Shadow probably looked better than it probably will on most bosses, just because we had a stacked 4-target council boss.
That didn't even feel that great, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty overwhelming, is kind of how I describe it. I played Void Form with Mind Spike. I think I played N'Zoth and Yogg.
I mean that just like looks like a stereotypical Yogg encounter right now, like just like farming out the shadowy boys. Shot's posted in chat said like that if you play Void Form and Mind Flay Insanity, you have a decent-ish rotational base for single target. Yeah. On Teros, which was the like most single target boss we've had so far, just the only pure single target boss actually, with relatively minimal movement. Like the spec feels pretty decent on that fight, but it doesn't feel any better than it ever really did in Shadowlands, and it feels much worse elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, because I think just looking back a little bit, I mean, I think there were people that didn't like Shadowlands, and Shadow's been reworked about a bajillion times, but I thought Shadowlands, at least single target and raiding, I thought was still like the most fun spec in the game, at least to me personally. It wasn't perfect by any means, but I think it's fair to say that Dragonflight Shadow single target doesn't feel like an improvement.
Yeah, it feels like at most a side grade.
I will say that this is probably the first time I've been looking to other specs and other classes to give me something that I'm lacking here. Like I'll run into a new patch and be like, oh, they changed this and that, but it's still Shadow. It's still this satisfying like loop of buttons that feels right to me. It feels at home. And this is kind of the first time, I'll be honest with you guys, that I feel a little bit lost with where the spec is.
Yeah, I do think there's like someone's raised point like that. Yeah, Shadow in Shadowlands was definitely, it had teething problems. There are a lot of issues with it, but in terms of just bashing one target as a caster, I don't think there's any spec that played better than it. I think it played significantly worse in loads of other situations that other casters excelled in.
For sure.
But if you give me a single target encounter, I don't think any other spec had more going on for its rotation than Shadow did.
Yeah, and it also consequently was also one of the best single targets in the game. Like I think if you go back and look at fights like Skull-X, obviously Skull-X was probably I think the best example of Shadowlands, but Shadow Priest was constant, even top 3 I think on that fight, if not first for a lot of it.
Which fight was that? Destroyer or
Skull-X, the worm boss in Sepulchre?
Skull-X, you were top 3. Destroyer, we were top 1 in CN once.
Oh, Hungering Destroyer. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we were also kind of known for doing single target, right?
Yeah. And I do sympathize a lot with people who just don't want to be a pet spec or didn't like the fact we had to rely on Mindbender.
That's true.
Throughout the entire expansion as well. That's not ideal, and again, it seems to be the case once again.
Now we have more pets. What do you mean?
We have even more pets than we did prior, and we're even more reliant on them to do damage.
Bring on the pets.
I don't know. Saeldur's loving pets though, right?
God, it's horrendous.
I mean, how much of this damage breakdown right here is pets? 30% or something?
30. Yeah, I was gonna say 20. Well, it obviously depends on single target or multi-target, because we have Shadow Fiend / Mindbender, Yogg-Saron, your Cthulhu tendrils. Yeah, that's it, right?
Yeah, and I think everyone's in relative agreement that the AoE rotation throughout Shadowlands, whilst arguably functional, was not fun.
Oh, I got a lot to say about the AoE and the Mythic Plus stuff. Do we have any more points about Raid we want to bring up before we move on to AoE? I think I was gonna say earlier, Shadowlands, we were kind of the single target gods, right? To a certain extent, that's the only thing that we were really great at in raids.
I always had fun on a single target fight. I always felt like I knew what I was gonna push. I always had a plan, and I was always yeah, let's go. It's time to blast. So I mean,
but it wasn't. Sure. But that's not historically true for Shadow, right? I think, and this is something we've been talking about for a while. Of in years past, you brought specs like Shadow Priest, Balance Druid, Affliction Warlock, for spread cleave, council stuff or whatever, which I do feel that hasn't been great the last couple expansions.
I feel that's a game-wide issue.
Yeah.
Where Blizzard have kind of decided that spread cleave is not a thing anymore. We don't want specs doing spread cleave anymore.
Yeah.
And we're gonna give each spec that used to be able to do spread cleave some sort of unique, interesting take on making their dots work in another way to give the spec more still keep its identity, but also fit the damage patterns they want to be in the game. So and some specs have adapted to this far better than others. Shadow probably being the one that adapted to it the worst, because the idea that they had for it was very I don't know.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that Affliction and Balance haven't exactly been stable either. If you're looking at the last couple expansions, right?
Yeah, they haven't. Moonkin Starfall is a point of entirely of its own, but Affliction Warlock's ability to dot everything in range and do AoE by just dotting things died around the same time Shadows did after BFA.
Yeah, so they've kind of
And-
shifted away from dots being powerful for a lot of us, basically.
Yes.
And then you're kind of left with, well, then what does Shadow have left? And I think they've been trying to rework it ever since.
Yeah, they've been
with-
trying to answer that. They've been trying to
Yeah.
answer that question for all three, for like Affliction as well, and that with people's reaction to Malefic Rapture,
Yep.
I think they're probably just generally struggling to give dot specs a reasonable non-dot based identity
Mm.
once they realize that they can't have dots do what they used to.
Yeah, and like for a brief period of time in Legion, we had stacking dot damage. That didn't last very long until it got kneecapped and nerfed like 5 times or whatever. So like I think it's still part of the game that could get scaled out of control, right? Or like in Dragonflight, they brought back Mind Spike, and we can talk about Mind Spike for a little bit because we haven't really hit it too much. Everyone's favorite shadow filler spell.
I mean, my opinion on Mind Spike is that if you're ever hard casting it over Mind Flay, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong.
Oh, for sure, but like I think that was my point of like they initially brought it back as a thing to remove removed your dots. I think it removed all 3, didn't it?
Yeah, I removed all of them.
It always removed all 3 dots,
Yeah.
but it felt like the point of it was like to give you the button to then immediately give you the proc afterwards, and the proc was what you're supposed to care about.
Right.
And design decisions around why are you making me pay two different points to make 1 point valuable aside.
Yeah.
Mind Spike as a proc in the rotation is something we've had in the past. It's something people have really liked in the past,
Mhm.
and it does make some semblance of sense. Why that needed to be Mind Spike and couldn't just have been a rework of Dissonant Echoes, I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, and I think the other big problem is Mind Melt. I think like I don't know. It feels like the majority of our problems right now is the third talent or the second talent after Mind Spike, which is called Mind Melt, which is every Mind Spike gives you a stacking buff to your next Mind Blast, increasing its crit and cast time and reducing its cast time. So every 2 Mind Spikes in between a blast will give you extra 50% crit on Mind Blast. It used to be 100%, but I feel like this talent is like the core reason why we're having so many problems with Mind Spike, right?
This talent is the main reason why hardcasting Mind Spike is good.
Yeah.
The talent itself is an amalgamation of the original text of Mind Spike from Cataclysm and the minor glyph that was added in Mists of Pandaria. The minor glyph that was added in Cataclysm and stayed until middle of Mists, I believe, where you could cast 2 Mind Spikes and get an instant Mind Blast afterwards.
And there was obviously Clarity of Power, right? That was in there too.
Clarity of Power is Warlords. That's much, much later.
Okay. Right.
Mind Spike appeared originally in Cataclysm and existed as just like, this is a thing to press when dots don't do anything on the target you're hitting.
Yeah, which isn't really a thing anymore, right? Like that.
No, it's not. Mastery kind of made that not a thing because you need to be able to hit. You need to be able to put dots on things to do relevant damage to them because there's so many dot interactions in the tree. We have Mastery on top of that, and so they removed the remove dots thing from Mind Spike for this version in Dragonflight.
In Dragonflight, because I think, and this is a good point, because our dots used to be, and I'm making a bit of assumptions here because I didn't play as much Shadow as you guys maybe did, but our dots were kind of, you put your dots up, they do taking damage, done, right? That's all. That's what they're there for, right? But now in Dragonflight, if you don't have your dots up, you're missing out on like half of the talent tree's procs, you know. Or mastery activation.
Mastery,
and all that stuff.
Yeah, like back in Cataclysm, the only thing that affected you when you had dot, the only thing outside of dot damage that dots did was you had the original version of Auspicious Spirits, or Shadow Apparitions, which was just Shadow with Pain Ticks have a chance to generate a ghost that walks very, very slowly towards your target. The original ones were incredibly slow, and they were also enemies, so people could hit them in PvP, which is amusing.
Oh, really? Man, I didn't play that. That's funny.
It caused a lot of problems when classes had like powerful when you kill a target procs, so we were kind of glad to see that be removed. But the other thing that was interesting about spirits back then was if you were moving, you had 3 times the chance to proc a spirit. it was like a pseudo like mobility tool in a sense to like add damage when you couldn't cast, which was very weird and kind of interesting. And it meant like running around in circles when you had 10 targets was a DPS increase. So interesting.
So I mean, the point is, Shadow has changed so much. I think
the point is, like,
they haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, Mind Spike's role in the new rotation just doesn't make any sense because the spec has changed so much since it was last ability.
Yeah.
And Mind Spike has had like 4 different iterations throughout history as well, so they had to even pick one of those to start with. It doesn't make sense.
And I know Jearv is a big fan of Mind Spike. I think he said it's his favorite button.
Yeah, I love it, especially Mind Melt.
Great.
I was gonna say we all pretty much agree here that the cast time piece of Mind Melt is pretty silly, especially on the 1 stack, right? Like,
yeah, it's a great addition for PvP.
I was
like,
gonna say,
you
I
have,
don't want to
you
invoke
have,
PvP,
you
but
have so many instant casts in PvP, and like that is like the one place where the version of Shadow we're getting right now makes sense? Question mark.
Oof.
But like, it's just there's so much wrong with how it's been implemented for the rest of the game, unfortunately.
I'm gonna get this out there right now just to frame my perspective. I really don't play very much PvP at all. I did RBGs just for gear. And so I'm not going to invoke PvP very much, other than to just be disappointed when they said, "Hey, we did this for PvP."
Yeah,
that's about it. I don't have a lot of perspective there myself.
I mean, back before I used to raid, I was doing RBGs and battlegrounds almost the entire time I played. PvP was like my bread and butter. I was never amazingly good at arenas, but I got like my gear and my titles typically.
Okay, so you're the reason why everything we have is bad. That's what you're saying. It's your fault.
Well, more that my perspective on things is that there is a legitimate set of the play like area of gameplay where the spec makes more sense than it does in PvE, but it still doesn't make enough sense to justify any of the changes.
Right. That makes sense. I just want to know that I can blame you for these problems. Is my point. And
it's always fault for sure.
Okay.
Yep.
It's everything is always somehow my fault. So sure.
But I think like to round off Mind Spike, I think what my biggest frustration with this is that as much as I'm like a SimC numbers guy, I can't look at a talent tree and be like, yeah, this is where you press Mind Spike, obviously, without checking the numbers or, writing an APL for it. And I think like that's the failure for a filler spell like Mind Spike being added in the tree.
We've had 2 or 3 patches since they said that was a problem, and I still don't feel like that's gotten any better.
No, I don't think they've changed it. Well, they nerfed Mind Melt, I think, was the only
They nerfed Mind Melt, and they massively nerfed the damage of Mind Spike relative to Mind Flay, but it doesn't matter because it's still better to press Spike on single target. And also, there are so many interactions with Mind Spike and Mind Flay spread all over the tree.
Yeah.
That it's incredibly difficult to parse in your head which one is better than the other and why.
Yeah, it's kind of
just by reading the talents.
It's like based on kind of the other stuff you're picking, and maybe Saeldur, you're going to say this of like, do you have Mind Flay Insanity? Doesn't work with Mind Spike. Do you have Mind Melt? Doesn't work with Mind Flay, right?
Yeah, I was about to say that. I literally, just before this podcast started, was doing some experiments into this, and Mind Spike ends up beating you in a lot of scenarios just because stuff like manipulation exists, and obviously Mind Melt.
Oh, right.
Because Mind Flay does not work on manipulation.
Which is, for those that don't know, manipulation is the new-ish Mind Games talent in the class tree, where Mind Blast and Mind Spike reduce its cooldown by 1 second each cast.
I'd completely forgotten about that one.
Yeah.
Yes, that's like there's just so much like random stuff all over the tree that references Mind Spike or Mind Flay, and not both.
And I think a lot of it could be better if, and some people in the chat have said this, or we've been talking about this for a while, right? Of like, oh, if you talent into Mind Spike, it just straight up replaces Mind Flay on your bars. Like, you only have one of them. But the problem with that is there are so many of these talents that only work with one or the other. And, like, wouldn't even make sense if Mind Spike worked with them,
The other problem with that is that, like, the really enjoyable part of Mind Spike's gameplay was when it was purely a proc to use, and you otherwise casted Mind Flay. So, again, I don't understand why they needed to bring the spell back with no function, and then bolt all of its actual purpose onto extra talents afterwards. Like, if you take Mind Spike and don't take Surging Darkness, you have picked a button that doesn't do anything.
Yeah. And I think, like, back to your other point, and they've talked about this as well, and I don't think they really got a chance to make many changes, but the button bloat of Shadow Priest. I think a lot of us would agree that Shadow is already kind of has a lot of buttons that you press somewhat actively in your rotation in Shadowlands, and, like, unequivocally, it's just gotten worse, right?
Yes, I'd say there are two kinds of button bloat. There is general rotation stuff, where, like, dot specs in general just have this more than other specs because we have dots to apply, and rotational abilities. So, like, just in terms of the number of things you have to keybind to do your optimal single target rotation is already kind of high.
Yeah.
And then you have, like, 30 to 60 second cooldowns that just need to be pressed on CD but don't really do anything. And Shadow has, like, 6 of them.
Divine Star, Halo,
so much.
Mind Games,
Shadow Crash, Void Torrent,
Void Damnation,
Dark Ascension. There's just loads of them. Like a strong 2-minute, like PI and Void Form, like I tend to discard in the button bloat thing because they can go on less used keybinds and they can be less relevant for the players who just, like, want to get on with the game.
Yeah.
But, like, there's so many things in the 30 to 60 second cooldown mark that just don't need to exist, or rather are cool that they exist, but I don't know, like, it's hard to
you can only have so many cool spells, right? Like, you can't just keep and it's hard because, and this is where I'll take partial blame. Like, sometimes as a community we have dumb ideas, like, we're just dumb, right? And a lot of us were like, oh yeah, we want Halo, Divine Star, and Cascade back. But then, like, if you actually think about it, you know, that is just kind of button bloat. And sure, there are some situations, and I've for sure had some of these where, like, pressing Halo is fun, pressing Divine Star is fun.
Halo's healing in the raid encounters was, like, one of the things I actually noticed as being, like, actually kind of good. Like, pressing Halo when everyone was low was, like, effective and relevant, and it kind of felt really good to be able to do that again.
I guess that one's an interesting one for sure. But for me, the thing that definitely kills me about these sort of 30-second rotationals is when they don't feel like they're having an impact on the rest of my rotation, that I don't feel like they're interacting with sort of the other buttons that I'm pushing. So when it is, hey, it's time to push Mind Games, I'm going to do a bit more damage this time,
It gets even worse when they all line up, and it's like, okay, now I'm going to press Mindbender, Mind Games, Halo, Dark Ascension. I've gone 6 seconds and I haven't really pressed any rotational buttons. It's like, it's very weird. It feels like a departure.
So that's the thing. Like, yeah, go Sail.
My problem with it is that a lot of the interactions, because they do exist, are all like passive and hidden away. Like, they're mostly things like cooldown reduction. It's just, oh great, I didn't notice that. Like, yeah, you get to press like twice as many it's not quite twice as many mind games nowadays with Mindflate Insanity, but you get mind games every 30 seconds, and it's like, oh, that's nice, I suppose. It does a lot of damage, but it's barely noticeable at the end of the day for most players. It's not like, press this button, this one lights up and does something significantly more noticeable.
Yeah,
which is what people I assume would want.
I do think cooldown reduction as a tool for Blizzard to mess around with has been both a blessing and a curse. It's worked really well for some specs, especially when Blizzard decide that, we're not gonna tune the spec down because its cooldown is now 3 times more frequent. We're just gonna leave it as is. Problem, definitely a problem for another time, but
I think, like,
cooldown reduction has worked out well for those people. But, like,
they sprinkle it everywhere.
For short duration CDs, cooldown reduction just feels very neither here nor there. And obviously it's having a really big impact, but it doesn't make the class feel better. Yeah.
And I think I do want to point out something, because Shot said this in chat. I totally agree. I think if you think about Halo, Divine Star, or even Mind Games, if it doesn't work this way today, as, like, if they're not damaging spells, I think I actually really like them. Where it's like, you press Halo when you just want to heal your group. Or, the off-healing capabilities of Halo and Divine Star, right? Rather than I press them on cooldown for the most damage. And they're kind of tuned that way a little bit. Mind Games definitely not, but yeah.
Yeah, Mind Games is just slam on cooldown, but Halo definitely does have that feel of, like, you should be trying to at least game it against damage.
Yeah.
I did some sims for that earlier, and not pressing Halo is basically DPS neutral, so you can just press it whenever you want or aim it for ads.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right place
healthy.
30 to 60 second buttons that don't really affect the rotation to B.
Yeah.
And they're also in the class tree, so they're not competing with actual damage that you would otherwise be taking. They're just like, here's a neutral damage, here's a neutral ability that does decent burst AoE if you need to hit like 10 mobs immediately, and has good group healing in like triage moments. Divine Star I'm a little less clear on because the cooldown is so short that you don't want to miss uses. And and I don't want to end up in a Malkarok situation where the entire raid is stacking in front of my face and I just have to press it on cooldown for the raw HPS.
Yeah, and again, this is just kind of from like a rating perspective. We can try kind of switch gears, I think. And let's talk about our favorite topic. Jearv's especially favorite topic is how Shadow plays right now in Mythic Plus. And I think this is something I'm not sure how many of you guys are like big into Mythic Plus as a thing. I know like me personally, I've never been like the 20-man raid environment's for sure better than the 40-man classic raids I was doing, but I do really enjoy just having 5-man content that feels like progression. So like that's kind of my favorite part of the game, is being able to have fun and feel useful in that space. And I feel like, and I'll just give my 2 cents before anyone else wants to kind of jump in next, but I think undeniably Shadow feels worse in keys for me than it did in Shadowlands. And I think the reason why that's so upsetting is because we got like one of the first blue posts we had months ago at this point, I don't even remember, was, hey guys, we hear you talking about you don't like Searing Nightmare, right? You don't like the current AoE. We have plans to fix it and address it, which included removing Searing Nightmare. And then we got a bunch of these things that don't really fit together. And we can dive into this in a second, but we have so many different ways of doing AoE. I feel like none of them really make sense or fit together. Shadow Flame Prism, Shadow Crash, Dark Void, Misery, Dot Spreading, Idol of N'Zoth, Idol of Yogg-Saron, Idol of Cthulhu. But like, there's no like centralized playstyle anymore, which is the one thing that Searing Nightmare did give us. And the replacement button that we got with Mindseer being a spender is just kind of, it's just, yeah.
Are any of you guys playing Pain of Death? Because that's one I see on here on that blue post as helping our gameplay.
I forget that talent exists like all the time.
Points for it.
Like, you don't have points for it, and you can't put pain on enough things for it to matter.
You can with Dark Void, but then you're playing Dark Void, not Misery, which is already bad.
Oh, and I forgot Psychic Link. That's another one. And like, why is having all of these bad? I think it's because none of them are good.
I will say one thing, despite not necessarily in favor, but as a point that's somewhat positive. Shadow in AoE in Mythic Plus dungeons and things feels much more like a Shadow Priest than it ever did in Shadowlands.
Sure.
But that's not a good thing, because Shadow Priest has never been able to do AoE in dungeons for like outside of ridiculous dot scaling in Legion and late Legion and late BFA. Shadow has, since I've played the spec, never had a coherent or like strong AoE dungeon game plan ever.
Yeah.
And if I could highlight one thing just on that theme, we can go back to how it achieves that, but just one point I wanted to note is just even how important M+ is as sort of a core gameplay element of the game these days. Like if you look before Legion, sure there were challenge modes and that kind of thing, but M+ is such an integral part of gearing your character these days, of doing your weekly 15s, and even playing at like a 20 level now in Dragonflight is going to be really important to getting sort of your best gear for raid. That it doesn't make sense to me for a class to not have a coherent AoE rotation, have strong burst, strong sustain, and all the tools that you need to succeed through control and those sorts of things. So Sael, carry on with the AoE point. I just really want to make that clear where I'm coming from, that M+ is important, and performance in M+ is important.
Yeah, I was about to say that a lot of the problems stem from just a lack of core. Like, they haven't really shown us what they want us to have. They haven't told us what they want any of our idols to do, for example. Like, you can assume that N'Zoth is for AoE based on how it works, but is Yogg meant for AoE? Is it for funnel? Is it for single target? Currently, it does all of them. But
or Cthulhu, like who the heck knows? I don't know. Like
yeah.
like I don't know, like I just want to bring one thing. Like Hikari in the chat just said like, yeah, current play style is more affliction than affliction itself. I love it. Like current on beta, like yeah, Shadow plays like Shadow Priest of old in dungeons right now, but Shadow Priest of old was really, really bad at dungeons.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the like how do you
Something
you
needs to
can't
happen.
tune it like how do you tune dots to work on single target and then dots to work on AOE? You know,
I'll
like
tell
it's yeah.
I'll tell you, what you do is you increase Vampiric Touch's damage by 500%, nerf literally everything else about the spec, and say Shadow does 70% damage on one target, but 140% damage on two targets, like it used to do in Cataclysm.
There you go. But obviously
the
they're
only way
scared
of
of that,
doing
right? And
They're
but
not
I think
going to do that is the thing.
yeah, and they
Why not?
haven't.
Twins.
We have worse
sense.
dot spreading now than we do in Shadowlands. Just it's just worse, right? Like we
Yes.
used to have Searing Nightmare that was effectively spammable on like mass AOE. So like
Like, to be clear,
10 plus.
Searing Nightmare. We hate Searing Nightmare. It sucks. Nobody wants to be pressing Searing Nightmare all the time as
Yeah.
their rotation in any form of AoE content.
No.
However, Shadow is built in such a way right now that unless you have Shadow Word Pain on every single thing you're in combat with, you aren't doing damage.
Yeah, because that's activating your mastery and it's triggering anything else that works with Shadow Word Pain right now, including things like Shadowy Insight. If you're taking Tormented up spirits, you get more spirits with, you know, Shadow Word Pain up.
I'd also like to point out.
The big one is Coalescing Shadows.
It's Coalescing Shadows is the big one, but also it's also giving you way more insanity for your next pull because it's giving you death throws and everything. Like,
Oh
when
yeah,
the pack
good
dies,
point.
if it's all got pain on it, you just get 60 insanity for free and you're set for the next pull. Like,
Yeah,
you
but
can play
spreading
like that
Shadow Word
if pain was
Pain
on everything,
is
but it's not.
like what, twice as hard, 3 times more work now than it is in Shadowlands. I mean, it's ridiculous, right?
It's gone. Applying Shadow Word Pain has gone from a completely free action that is also your highest damage per execute time AoE ability
Yeah,
to 4 targets on a 30-second cooldown or 15 targets on a 30-second cooldown that would also not be your highest damage per execute ability at the time,
yeah.
and otherwise just manually pressing Shadow Word Pain or Vampiric Touch of Misery. It's just not viable.
And I think, to be clear, this is, you know, if you're looking at just like, let's just say like 4 to 6 targets as like one area, I think it's actually fine. Like, yeah, it takes a bit longer to ramp than you're used to, but especially if you're like void forming that pack or whatever, like, you know, you're talking about 4 to 6 globals with Misery to dot that pack. Like, not the best in the world, but it's fine. I think it's playable. The problem is more than that.
Yeah,
right?
the payoffs aren't there even after you have the dots.
Well, yeah, that's yeah, different. I think different problem. But I'm just talking about like our ability to dot packs. Like obviously we still have Misery, and you know now we can have Misery all the time without feeling like we're losing the Searing Nightmare damage. So like on those kind of, I'd say like up to like 4 to 6 target range, you know, we do have Misery. So like that, there is that. The problem is anytime you're pulling more than that or chaining packs together, like what the hell do we do?
Yeah, I'd like to point out that Dark Void, when last time Dark Void was in the game, when it was an uncapped apply Shadow Word Pain to every single thing, while in Sims and in like more ideal situations, it looked like it should be the way to go in dungeons. Misery was still better because so often you ended up in situations where you needed to apply dots and it hadn't been 30 seconds since you last tried to.
Yeah.
And like the game Mythic Plus is way too fluid for you to plan your ability to do any amount of damage at all around a 30-second cooldown. It just doesn't work.
It's not fun, I think, is the way that I would put it,
Yes.
right? Like you
I
want
have
to.
further points on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
My issues right now is that the rotation kind of feels better up to about 8 targets at the most in terms of applying dots, but we've mentioned that we don't get any reward for doing so. But that's assuming you're playing Misery and Shadow Crush. If they want us to play Dark Void to actually put pain on everything, that doesn't work anymore. It just instantly falls apart. And it just becomes awful.
Well, it actually
Right,
doesn't do
exactly.
anything, right? Because we still need Vampiric Touch. Like it's not like
Vampiric
Shadow
Touch.
Word Pain is, and I think this is a good thing, right? They did split. We used to have a lot of effects in one or the other, but now I think they have actively tried to say, oh, some of these effects are Vampiric Touch, some of these are Shadow Word Pain, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But that means we need both dots, you know. And the only
Yeah,
thing that
like
gives us both dots right now is playing Shadow Crash plus Misery, and then you get both dots on 4 targets every 30 seconds. That's it.
And the other thing is, the cooldown is not ideal. Like, quite often the pack's
Yeah.
gonna die too fast, or if you have like a really long pack, you're gonna have to cast a second Shadow Crash, and you go pull the next pack, and no Shadow
Or
Crash.
or you end up in a situation where your tank is pulling from 3 different directions, and you have to
Mhm.
wait for every single thing to be underneath the tank before you can even dot anything. And it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, this is pathetic.
Well, you can fade dot a little bit. Like, that's still a thing.
Yeah,
But like,
it's still like it's like everyone else just gets to start AoEing instantly and just like going
Yeah.
off, and it's
We
like
have
you have
setup.
to wait for everything because you have one chance to do any AoE and you have to wait for it.
yeah. And Jearv,
Say
can you?
that, yeah, BFA.
I kind of want Jar's perspective a little bit on like, because I think you kind of brought up like, almost every other pack that you're playing, you don't have Shadow Crash on pull, right? So like, what are you even doing?
Yeah. I
think-
kind of
I
want to
think-
touch on the Dark Void point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, I put out a list on like low value dot spreading, and like every other low value dot spread in the game has no cooldown, but they usually have a small cost, like Howling Blast, Seed of Corruption, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you can always cast it, but it costs a little bit, like 1 rune, or maybe it could cost 10 insanity or something like that.
Well, so
Then
kind
you
of
have
Searing
one that's a
Nightmare,
higher
right?
value that
Yeah,
you have
Searing
to
Nightmare.
plan around with.
Yeah, like every other spec that incorporates dots into their rotation, 1 dot is effortless in AoE.
Yeah.
Is what I would say. It doesn't require an extra button you wouldn't have pressed otherwise, and it puts them on everything in combat all the time.
Yeah. Or there's specs where they can just funnel off of 1 target. Like, I think that's the other kind of weird or interesting, however you want to put it, because they've kind of put a lot in the tree of like Psychic Link, Pain of Death, Idol of Yogg to a certain extent. That's kind of like almost trying to make us like the Blade Flurry of range specs in a way of like, oh yeah, we just want you to A, spread dots, and then B, funnel on 1 target.
Yeah,
And I've
that does
definitely. Yeah, sorry. I was gonna like I've crackpot suggested just making Shadow a Blade Flurry spec in the past when we've been like pretty predominantly single target focused, but not with everything else. Like
I mean, yeah, Shadow.
not with
like,
all this other stuff.
Yeah.
This is kind of the Shadow Priest of old as well. Like the AoE we did used to do back when we didn't even used to have an ability that could spend resources to do AoE damage at all. What we just had was massively scaling resource generation per target you're in combat with.
Yeah, which like, and obviously we don't like a lot of that has gone away now with Mind Seer's no longer a filler. That we just like we have no AoE filler anymore, and it feels terrible. Like you will be pressing Mind Flay a lot in AoE, just because you have nothing else to do and you need insanity, right?
I don't necessarily think a lack of AoE filler is a problem. I think a lack of payoff for insanity in AoE is a problem, and coupled with that your insanity generation barely scales with the number of targets you're in combat with.
Yeah, because like totally nerfed and kneecapped Maddening Touch, which did do a lot of that, and Idol of Cthulhu's Mind Seer Tendril, or Void Lasher to be specific. And if you didn't,
I think idols just need their own topic at this point.
Yeah, and we can switch gears to idols, but I think if you guys didn't see, the Idol of Cthulhu nerf was you used to get. I think did you get 1 insanity per target that Cthulhu hit?
1 insanity per tick, so it made you 2 per label roughly of the lasher.
Right, and that scaled with targets. So as you got more targets, you got more insanity. And now they've changed it to where you still get insanity per tick, but only on 1 target capped. So Void Lasher AoE generation and AoE is basically unnoticeable.
Yeah, I want to bring up the point of like, even from like a thematic perspective, like Shadow's AoE, when it's the most fun, involves spewing 25 billion ghosts to every single target in combat.
Exactly.
Are we agreed?
Yeah, for
that's
sure.
Like that's like the most fun time you get in AoE. It was noticeable drastically that we weren't doing that again in Shadowlands.
Yeah.
A lot of people's experience has definitely been soured by the fact we don't have ghosts doing that sort of thing anymore.
Yeah.
They've kind of tried, quote unquote, to like give us some AoE interaction with ghosts with the thing that's alternative to Auspicious Spirits. but it's
Yeah.
just not very good.
Well, they also accidentally gave it to us with Shadowy Insight, which I know Jearv is still really depressed about this, but
Yes.
for like a brief, was it like a week or something? Or a couple weeks
well,
on
yeah.
beta?
Yeah, for a week they gave us the Warlords of Draenor and Mists of Pandaria version of Shadowy Insight, which was a flat 15% proc chance.
15
so
or
what
10?
pains you had?
That was
15.
10.
I think
That was
10.
10.
Alright, yeah,
It felt
10,
like
yeah.
15.
Okay, so yeah, basically
It
what
was low.
we're saying though is, so you spread it, they changed it to be Shadowy Insight, so Shadow Word Pain ticks have a chance to spawn a ghost. Or, sorry, not spawn a ghost, but give a free Mind Blast proc. And then obviously, if you consume that Mind Blast proc, you generate ghosts, right? So that was kind of the gameplay, where you could spread your Vampiric Touches and then just get flooded with these Shadowy Insight procs, and you just felt like you were machine gunning out ghosts. Because as you added dots, you also statistically got more procs.
Yeah, like that is what I would say is the Shadow Priest of old. That's how it used to work.
And that's what, like, BFA, everyone loved it. Like, that was a big thing in BFA too. Like, the Toll de Gore clips were fun to watch. You know?
Yeah, just dot machine gun is just way more fun than anything else from like a visual perspective. Mindseer's taking away from that a lot.
Yes.
And I don't even necessarily think the spec needs an AoE spender if they give us enough cleave tools to work with other things, that the rotation still works and has the ability to scale up with large amounts of targets. But if they're going to keep Mindseer, it needs interactions with ghosts, not only from a damage perspective, but just from a like make our AoE look fun perspective.
Yeah, it's and I think this is kind of the point I was trying to get earlier. Like, we have so many different things or mechanics that kind of make or do something in AoE, but they're not working together. And this is like probably the best example of Mindseer being an AoE filler, has no interaction with our mastery, no interaction with ghosts, and in making the comparison between Mindseer and Devouring Plague like really weird in AoE, because, you know, we're generating 0 ghosts per insanity with Mindseer, and Devouring Plague is giving us, you know, 1 all the way up to like, you know, X number of targets times 2, right? Or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's really, I think what's upsetting, frankly, is that like Searing Nightmare was given to us because we needed something in dungeons. Like, for any of you guys that were playing Shadow and BFA, like, there were times in BFA where Shadow was okay in keys, but it definitely still felt like it needed something, right? It wasn't finished. And the answer that we got was Searing Nightmare, which obviously has problems, but it did solve quite a lot of them. But it feels like we've kind of now gone backwards, because a lot of us were saying to remove Searing Nightmare, but I don't think we've gotten something that feels good enough.
Nothing replaces it, basically.
I have so many issues with Mindseer. The first thing is it doesn't even do the same damage per insanity that Searing Nightmare used to do.
No, it's like half as much, right?
Yeah, it's about 70% of a Searing Nightmare. And that is excluding the fact that Searing Nightmare didn't actually cost 30 insanity, typically. Because you cast it inside of Mindseer.
Yes, that's the other thing. It's like Shadow has gone from a spec that could build and generate resources at the same time, which effectively meant it had infinite resources.
Yeah.
We could just hold down Searing Nightmare, and that's why we were viable. Now we have the same numbers basically on Mindset. It technically does a little bit more damage, but it costs more insanity. But it doesn't. We don't have any way of making the resources to do that. We don't have any ways of passively producing resources. We almost had it with how the Cthulhu Tendril would have worked, but then they destroyed that.
I mean,
with Maddening Touch.
I do agree with Kevin that it's well, Vickland even, that it's great that our whole rotation is involved in AoE again.
I agree.
But they just need to work out a way to make it all feel like it's actually doing something.
And that's where we thought Ghost was the answer. Or like Shadowy Insight procs, you know, also felt fun of like, and I think the first thing that we suggested, and I think we were even talking about this of like, we wanted a legendary effect for exploding ghosts. That was like our first thing. I think Saeldur or Jearv or someone, you know, was like pitching this. And I love the idea of
just like,
make a talent that's like your ghosts fly 50% faster and they explode for square root scaled AoE damage on hit or something, right?
Yeah.
Because then you're effectively saying, okay, well, spread Vampiric Touch, so give something for us to spread Vampiric Touch, and then do your single target rotation, and now you're doing AoE damage, right?
And spew ghosts.
Yeah, by spewing ghosts. I think that's what a lot of us wanted.
Oh, that's another thing. Do you guys remember that week on Alpha where Devouring Plague spewed ghosts for ticks?
That was stupid, but also it was hilarious.
That was so much fun.
Yeah, but I think it's showing that, like, unironically, the best parts about playing beta Dragonflight and the most fun we've had with Shadow and AoE has been the bugs. It hasn't actually been the design intentions of, like...
Isn't that so true?
Like, we loved the Shadowy Insight stuff, and it really felt like it made sense with, like, the way Psychic Link worked and, like, other parts of the kit, you know?
I really think, like, the point we're getting to is, like, the more globals we get to spend doing the rotation that we already know is good, the single target one, makes AoE feel more fluid. Like, when we have to switch into AoE mode, it just starts getting so much worse, basically.
Yeah. Well, and mass AoE mode. So we're, you know, more than, let's just say 7 targets or something. Yeah. And
even then, like, it's still kind of messy at that point.
For sure.
Just because of how unreliable the dot spread tools we currently have are.
And that it just doesn't make sense with the rest of the game. And like, as Jearv pointed out, like, so many other specs have ways to spread dots because they need that, right? Like, dots in this game are not the raw damage they used to be. Like, I haven't looked at breakdowns recently, but, like, your dot damage in keys is not, like, that's not your top damage, right?
They're just your enabler.
Yeah, they activate and enable the rest of your kit. Right?
Yeah, and if you can't put your enablers up,
it feels bad.
You just don't do anything. You spend your whole time enabling your rotation and then never get to do your rotation.
Yeah.
Yeah, from my point of view, from a design perspective, we either need a way of literally putting dots on basically every single target nearly instantaneously. It could take 2 globals, like 1 for every dot. Alternatively, we need a way that lets a small number of dots scale up damage beyond the number of dotted targets, like, for example, exploding Baneling shadow apparitions.
Yeah.
If we could hit, like, targets that are dotted, and those explode and hit like a 20 mil pack, we can still do effective damage even if we don't have all the entire pack dotted.
Sure.
And then we can use Vampire Punches basically as a builder to put more dots up as we still keep doing damage. So we can press our instant target, 8 target Shadow Crash, start doing
ramping a little bit.
Damage, start using all of our buttons as we normally would. Then when we have free time, we put more Vampiric Touches up, and the damage will keep scaling up a bit.
Right.
Yeah, there's definitely ways to do it, but, like...
As it stands, nothing. We just don't have anything. Like, all the tools and kit that don't work. Idle and Off should technically do what I just said. It doesn't work because it has too many issues. We'll get to that later, I think.
And we were kind of close in a sense because we had Shadow Crash as a hasted cooldown that did this at 4 targets. And we're like, okay, you're kind of close. Just make Shadow Crash hit more targets, right?
Yeah.
But they've left Shadow Crash at 4 targets. And now the cooldown is no longer hasted, so you only get Shadow Crash every 30 seconds, which is not even close enough cooldown to sustain our dots that are lasting 21 seconds.
Well, this is when I wanted to jump in with, is Mental Decay doing enough for anything right now with how things are set up?
If you spend all your insanity doing Mindseer and keep the rotation up flawlessly, it just about bridges the gap.
But I think that's what are you playing around?
Realistically, it's not going to.
Depends on if you're pressing Mindseer, right?
Sorry, go for it.
You have to use only Mindseer, and you also have to have Mind Aura. You also need to get 1-ish Mind of Hour proc per 30 seconds, which is
that's
not
the
that
other thing. The rotation is, like, completely beholden to Mind of Hour procs
in AoE.
And N'Zoth procking N'Zoth actually procking on targets that it can proc on. Yogg-Saron successfully spawning a Yogg-Saron before a boss fight.
Ooh boy.
There are so many things that just needlessly complicatedly have to go right that you have no control over.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the idols. I think this is the last big thing. I think. Okay, go ahead.
I see a lot of people in chat saying that they should just uncap Shadow Crash and delete Dark Void. And I think that's a very dangerous road to go down.
Yeah,
I think we would all agree that uncapped VT on everything, doing that would be a little questionable without
honestly,
tuning.
I don't even think that gets there, because the point we tried to make is, like, the Mythic Plus is such a flexible area of gameplay And we learned this from Dark Void in BFA. Like,
Yeah.
putting every dot up on a 30-second cooldown is not good enough.
No, it's not. No.
Who said it
If you're
has to
ever,
be
if you're
30
ever
seconds
left
then?
having to manually apply dots, it just doesn't work.
Who
In this
said
case,
it
it
has to be
works.
30 seconds?
30-second cooldown VT on everything, maybe.
This would be enough because we'd still have misery due to how the interaction between Shadow Crash and misery works. So if we miss 4 mobs, we just put 4 VTs up and it'll actually be fine. The biggest issue in BFA was if you cast Dark Void and the mobs weren't perfectly stacked or they were straggling, you would miss like 3 mobs with Shadow Word Pain. They would require Shadow Word Pain anyway. Plus, you still had to cast Vampiric Touch.
Yes.
So you may as well
that's
cast
true.
Vampiric Touch 8 times rather than cast Vampiric Touch 8 times and 3 Shadow Word Pains and a Dark Void.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Obviously, if like N'Zoth worked in the way that we wanted it to, just more dots might help.
Maybe.
Mhm.
But yeah.
But
It's
yeah,
just-
I'm
uncapping Shadow
getting
Crash
at it.
completely is definitely scary.
The big thing for Dark Void for me is Tormented Spirits, but Tormented Spirits is also just not tuned well enough, and you also can't take it with Auspicious Spirits.
Yes.
If you could take Auspicious and Tormented at the same time, we would actually have a very nice scaling Insanity generation in Mythic Plus that would not be overpowered on single target. You just wouldn't take both together. And that would be very fun to play because you just have a passive amount of spirits coming out. BFA spirits were nice because they were passive. And having a way of taking our passive spirits back to or further augment our like Mind Blast and stuff, I think would go a long way to improving Mythic Plus feel.
Yeah, it would.
So I guess like to cap on your thought, Jearv, I think like if you had to suggest something that was not like toward changing the design of how it plays right now, what would be your suggestion? Like changing target caps or cooldowns or numbers of something. What would you like to see?
Spreading Shadow Word Pain, that's the low value dot. Should be like barely any cooldown. I don't think it should have any cooldown at all, and then a small cost. So you can always do it, so if you miss a couple mobs or if the tank pulls in a new pack, then you can just do it again. And then spreading VT that enables like almost your entire spec with Apparition, Psychic Link, all of that. It should be on a medium high CD, like 30 seconds, most slightly hasted as well. So that you have some skill left in the playstyle.
Would the VT be capped at 4 targets still, or you think that should be bumped to
I
like
think it should
6?
be like 8.
6 or 8? Okay.
VT at 8 and like Mindseer given a overhaul to like the Insanity generation rates we have and scaling with targets.
Sure.
Mindseer tick should just apply pain.
Yeah. So Mindseer ticks applying pain, and then Shadow Crash cooldown being hasted again, and then at 8 targets.
VT to 8, yeah.
Yeah, that would be
go a
the.
long way.
It would do.
That would
It would help. It wouldn't. I mean, we can argue about how much fun that is, but I think that would at least make it have some semblance of a flow, right?
That would get us to a place where we can put the enablers on the targets to the point, and then start doing things that should pay off. Then the question is, are the payoffs tuned well enough, and do they work?
Yep.
And the answer to that is, regardless of doing all the dot stuff right now, the answer to that is still no, because let's move on to the idols.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone anything else on AoE before we move on? Obviously, the idols are a bit AoE, but
I
Oh,
think I'm good.
one last thing about Mental Decay.
Yeah.
Because of the restrictions for Flay or Seer, you kind of need Seer to be valuable and good. Otherwise, the dots just won't last long enough, especially the manually casted ones, to be good. So they could potentially revisit that at some later point, say, turning it into Shadowy Apparitions. We used to have a tier set in the long, long time past that made Shadowy Apparition hits extend our dots. And if that just said, oh, your dots are extended by 1 second whenever a target is hit by a Shadowy Apparition, I'm not quite sure how good that would be. But on
Yeah.
single target, it's a moot point currently because dot extension is basically free. And on AoE, that would then let us play around spirits rather than having to be forced to press Mindseer permanently if we didn't actually wish to, which you will be because of dot maintain.
and there's also like there's a lot of talents that work with Mindseer and Mindflay, or maybe there's a couple, like 3 or 4, but they don't change what they're doing a whole lot. I think the only caveat is Screams does, but like Idol of Cthulhu and Mental Decay are like the same effect whether or not it's Seer or Mindflay. Like there's no, even though we're not filling with Mindseer anymore. So it feels like they just forgot or ran out of time of like, oh yeah, we cast Mindseer way less than we cast Mindflay now. Maybe Idol of Cthulhu needs a different proc rate for the Mindseer tendril, and maybe Mental Decay should be a few more seconds of dots for Mindseer. You know, things like that. because it feels like they're just being underutilized in AoE, right?
Yeah, it does.
So
That would also help fix it for Mindseer if you just made it like 2 or 3 seconds per turn of Mindseer. You don't have to cast as many Mindseers, because right now, if you don't cast your entire rotation of Mindseer, they just don't last.
Yep, exactly. All right, cool. So let's end this thing. We have a lot to talk about still about the idols. So we're gonna start left to right, which is basically least controversial to most controversial. So Idol of Yogg-Saron. I don't have a whole lot of like feedback directly on Idol of Yogg-Saron. For those that don't know, this is basically the Mindbender idol. So every time you press Mindbender, you get something extra. It's pretty boring. It doesn't really do a whole lot, but it's there. You know, feels like this is kind of the PvP idol. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this.
It's
I
just
don't
like
really.
a prism.
It's just a damage buff after Prism, and like
It's legitimately just the third point of Shadowflame Prism. You can take Inescapable 1, 2, and then 3. That's all it is.
Yeah, it's pretty lame.
I'm disappointed with what it ended up being, but in the face of other issues, I'm willing to take it or leave it.
We have bigger fish to fry, is what you're saying.
It's very generic, and it's pretty powerful. It's
like 5% damage or something, right?
Yeah, about 5%. The best effect is not the one that you get while the boss is on full HP, though, sadly.
Yeah, we want the 5-second extension, right? Which is the
we want the 5-second extension. Stunned is actually really good now that we've been nerfed in Insanity. Stunned is actually really good.
Oh, true.
And it is the best one, but good luck getting that one.
How many fears are we getting? Yeah.
I'm not looking forward to I'm not looking forward to the cheese required on fights with ads of trying to game this if it ever becomes a thing.
Yeah,
that's true.
Recap, how does this work? This is when you first cast Mindbender on a target that has one of these effects, it'll do the thing.
Yeah, so healthy is when the target is above 80% HP, you and your Shadowflame will gain 5% additional damage. If the target was enraged when you cast it, it will dispel the enrage and give you 5% haste. If the target was stunned, you will generate 5 insanity every second for the duration of your Mindbender. And if the target was feared, you will gain 15% increased damage, and the fear will not break.
Yeah. So
but this is on cast though.
Yeah.
And
this is going to be
none
a
of those
case of
5 seconds.
Yeah, this is a case of us running around the encounter space trying to find ads that we can fear.
Well, I mean, kind of, right? Because the problem is you have to take Inescapable Torment or Shadowflame Prism if you played Shadowlands to get in there. And so delaying Mindbender, which is a minute cooldown, to game any of these effects is like probably not worth it unless you're sure, delay 5 seconds, right? But yeah, I think
it's also just like annoying to have to target swap to something that you feared and then force your Mindbender back over to the other thing.
Yeah, it feels like a PvP thing, to be honest.
You gotta make a deal with the Warlock is the thing, Ellie. They get twins, and we get their hardcasted fear.
Their fear.
Does their fear work? All right.
Yeah,
I think it's as long as they have fear on them.
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. So that's Yogg-Saron. It's not.
Pretty hilarious.
It's not the best thing in the world, but it's fine. I don't. That's about all we have to say.
My biggest beef with it is that the healthy one is just not very good. The one that you get
on pull. Yeah. So if you're lusting on pull, it's losing value.
It's got to be deliberate though. Like it's.
Yeah.
I mean, it's it seems that you don't press Shadow Fiend on somebody and start doing a lot of damage, but that's kind of really annoying in PvE.
I mean, the thing is, like, people say, it's like, oh, you're charged like the PvP one. It's like, is it though? Like, Shadowflame Prism wasn't good in PvP this entire expansion. Relying on Mindbender in PvP is not particularly enjoyable or effective. And what the areas of the rotation that like people who are PvPing are really enjoying has like absolutely nothing to do with Mindbender.
Also, like a talent should never be one or the other. Like all of our talents should have some value in all game modes, right? Like you should be able to make a case for it. And I think that is true to an extent. It's just we're saying it's a pretty boring case for it.
It's very niche and like doesn't really do the thing that PvPers want to be doing with Shadow in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, people just assume it's the PvP one because of the fear line that doesn't break fear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's obviously going to be somewhat of a nothing burger, I think.
I think it's arguable that the effects might see like the different effects might see more like visibility in PvP, and it might be more relevant in PvP because most of the time we are just going to get the healthy effect and the extension effect. Let's be real, right? So I can see that characterization, but I would agree with you guys on the rest of it. I mean, they should be relevant for both PvE and PvP, and frankly, this might not even be that relevant for PvP if Mindbender isn't like top of mind. So.
Yep.
It just takes too many points for the PvPers. I don't think they'd mind taking the point for Mindbender and the charge, but they don't really want an inescapable torment because they can't hard cast Mind Blast, really. They have to press the instant ones.
I mean,
and they
it's
want
just like,
death when they get to like low HP so they can actually just kill them with it.
yeah, I mean,
They don't have the time, especially now that Shadow Word Death isn't hasted. I'm sorry, we forgot
Good
about that
God.
earlier.
Yeah.
Shadow Word Death is not hasted anymore. PvPers cannot afford to just
straight
fling Shadow Word Death.
it's just a straight up 20-second cooldown. But yeah, I mean, like,
So-
I don't know. PvPers have not enjoyed relying on Mindbender whenever they've ever had to, and making them do it again is just not gonna go well. But yeah, next one, Idol of Cthulhu.
Soon.
Idol of Cthulhu. So this is coming back from the legendary, which is called Eternal Call to the Void, or whatever. We've had this in a few different iterations now, but yeah. So this is more or less the same. They did buff its proc rate coming from Shadowlands, so it's now a 2 RPPM hasted effect. So you'll get about 2 procs per minute affected by your haste. Is what this is what it currently is. And
Yeah,
if you press Mind Flay, you get the Mind Flay tendril. If you press Mind Sear, you can proc the Mind Sear tendril. The problem is they're on the same proc rate, which made sense in Shadowlands, I think, but doesn't really make sense anymore. So if you're casting a bunch of Mind Flays and then you switch to Mind Sear, you know, they're sharing that same proc rate pool. So it makes its kind of ability to be like a hybrid effect pretty lackluster, because I think in AoE or in keys, like, you getting the Mind Sear tendril is going to be so rare anyways.
Yeah, I mean, even when we had the Mind Sear tendril, like, in Shadowlands, it was terrible.
Yeah, you picked it
That's
for the
all-
insanity. It's an insanity talent.
Yeah,
There's more
like,
glaring issues with it than that.
Sure.
you know,
Sorry to cut you off, but I did a lot of testing with this like a week and a half ago, just before they nerfed it, and it was
Yeah.
actually really good.
Yeah.
They literally had it bug fixed for a single week where it worked. Before that, I couldn't test it, so I did a lot of.
Oh, that's
testing
right. It
with
wasn't doing anything.
It wasn't doing anything.
Yeah.
So you actually got a lot of mindset tendrils because you pressed actually a significant amount of time was spent mind searing. You did press mind flay and it would eat some of them, but it wasn't a big a deal. The actual problem with it was that, especially if it's like things like single target, it said it's an RPPM effect. You're meant to get 2 of them a minute, but you spend a quarter of your time mind flaying. You don't get 2 a minute. You get 1.
Yeah. I mean, it's a filler spell, right? Like, it's attached to the fillers of the kit, you know, and it's a random
Yeah, I
proc,
think-
you know.
and I think that no matter what the tuning ends up being on it, same issue I have with your charge. It just doesn't feel like a capstone.
It doesn't.
No. It's not
It
impactful
was really nice when
enough.
it gave you AoE resources, but now it doesn't. They're homogenized. The tendrils are the same. You don't really care if you get the sear or the flay one. They
Yeah.
both don't do any damage, and they both give you the same resources. It's just whatever. Why would I take this?
I think that's the point. Is like you like, the idol isn't a thing of like, oh, I want X, Y, or Z, so obviously I'll pick Idol of Cthulhu. I think like that's kind of our current problem. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
unless the build is centered around Mind Sear or Mind Flay, like, it doesn't really make sense. And the problem with all of those builds is if you're doing that, especially in AoE, you're no longer foregoing apparitions as a thing you care about, because Mind Sear doesn't generate apparitions. So it's like you'd have to give up quite a lot, I think, to invest in Cthulhu or like that playstyle, which
agreed.
is okay. Like, in single target, I think makes a bit more sense, but AoE is just, I
No.
don't even know. Yeah.
Like,
It
it could
feels
do
like
something even more interesting. Like, it could also activate screams. It's locked behind screams. Why doesn't it activate screams on the tyrant target for its duration as well?
It could also
Stuff like
just
that.
have been. It could also just have been out a 4-piece bonus right now.
Yeah, it could just be
Frankly.
the focus. Way more interesting.
Or they could make it do damage. I think that's the other thing, is these tendrils really don't do a whole lot of damage. They're really just there as the insanity proc. So basically the problem with Cthulhu is every time they nerf or buff or change our spenders, its value gets wildly different, rather than it just doing damage by itself, which I think is another way they could attack it, right? Like, if they don't want us generating all this freaking insanity in AoE with Idol of Cthulhu, then just make the Void Lasher tendril do a lot of damage. Like, that's
Yeah,
you could do that too.
Feels very completely wasted point currently, effectively.
Yeah.
Next one, Speaking of completely wasted points,
Oh,
Idol of Yogg-Saron.
Stop it.
What?
Idol of Yogg is like all of our damage. What do you mean?
It's like
All of
our
our damage, asterisk. Very specific situations.
Yeah, so you can't play it in keys. Everyone thought you could play it in keys, but it turns out that bosses reset your stacks in a dungeon. So you'll go from having like 80 or 90 stacks ready to about to have some fun to having none and then leaving the dungeon.
Which might be a bug.
This one might need a little bit of preamble and a little bit of like explanation, I think, for the people who either haven't been like actively testing on beta or like really following along, because this one did get a couple of changes recently from where it was for most of beta. So I mean, I can try and overview, and if I miss anything, let me know. Just before we jump right back into that, the thing was, so originally for most of beta, this thing was spawning on spellcast and not on ghost spawn. And it required sort of 50 spellcasts of things that spawn ghosts to create the little guy, and then the guy would just shoot little balls at the enemy, and it didn't really do good damage, but it hit them. Whatever. We kind of assumed it was bugged for all of beta. We're just kind of waiting for a change, basically, because whatever. So they recently basically quote unquote fixed it, but to actually spawn on apparitions. But at the same time, they made it spawn on 200 apparitions, which I don't know about you, I'm not spawning on average 4 ghosts every time I push a spell, so obvious clear nerf there on that part. And frankly, I think they buffed the damage pretty considerably, especially in the most recent patch where they brought it back down to 100. But something that people might not have been noticing, because this has been sort of part of the sims that we've been running and all this sort of stuff, is that there are builds that you can run that are ostensibly competitive builds that just will not spawn this thing ever in a fight, right? Like that you can run, for example, if you were to play Dark Ascension, you're almost never spawning this thing in comparison to like
it's like 7 minutes, 6 minutes.
game.
What is it?
With Dark Ascension, you'll get your first Yogg slightly over 3 minutes in.
Yeah, and that's after the change to 100, right? It's a little better than it was before. But
I mean, we did some testing. Like if you that's if you don't take Dark Ascension, yes. If you don't take Dark Ascension and you don't take Mind Devourer, it's 5 minutes 50.
You mean, wait, what?
If you take DA, if you take DA and you don't take Mind Devourer, it's 5 minutes plus.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, depending on the talents you pick, the idol is just basically borderline worthless.
Yes.
Which, like, it's a talent tree, right? Like, I don't think that's necessarily terrible, but like for a capstone talent, that's not very intuitive. That, like, you wouldn't know that, right? It's not.
I'd also say that the design overall of just after you do some amount of X, get Y, is a very contentious design, because it leads to abilities that only do something multiple like minutes or like a decent period of time after combat has begun. And with what we've said with like the fact that when you encounter a dungeon boss, it immediately resets your stacks, having a really high payoff for a really high investment like this is just never particularly enjoyable, especially because when it spawns, you're not doing anything.
No.
You just have a man who hits harder than you do for 20 seconds.
And it doesn't scale with
feel
mastery
good.
or void form or shadow form. It only scales with our haste and our stats. Like that.
Let's be real. If it did scale with mastery, the thing would be hitting for 55k per bolt, and it would be obscene.
It does that already.
That's the terrifying part. Like that
Yes.
might be a bug, that it doesn't scale with void form and it doesn't work with our mastery.
Yeah,
It's hitting too hard. It's not proccing in a way that makes it reliably like a reliable talent that you want to play with, right?
I'd also like to raise the comparison point that there is another talent on a different tree for another spec that functions very, very similarly, but got it right.
Which talent
And
is that?
that's every 20, now nerfed to 30 Moonfire ticks drops a full moon
Oh, sure.
for Balanced Druid. And like that's way more frequent, way less impactful, doesn't have a duration, it's just, it happens and bam. Like, the fact that the Yogg-Saron has a 20-second duration is a really big problem as well, because he needs to be valuable for all 20 seconds.
Otherwise, you wasted 3 minutes
I'd
or whatever.
rather just have, like, a short, sharp, bam, this is good.
Yeah.
and a counter that ticks up, and when it ticks to that, when it ticks up to the number it needs to tick up to, it does a thing, and that number should be relatively low and relatively consistent. Right now, it is hideously inconsistent, hideously weighted in power, and generally not very fun even when it's active because of how many caveats it has.
The way I see it is when you have an effect like this that takes so long to set up that that it we're talking 2.5 minutes to get the thing. It clears on boss pull, which is nuts, especially in dungeons. But all of this stuff, it ultimately communicates to me. It tells me, hey, this is something that you would want to build your gameplay around, that you'd want to build your cooldowns around. That hey, this thing comes up at 2 minutes 20 seconds into the fight. Maybe that's when you want to push your void form PI and God forbid PI the things so that it hits like a truck, right? And I mean, I know I have my own thoughts, but is this doing that? Is this something that you actually want to play around right now? Or
Yes.
Well, I mean, damage-wise, the answer is yes. It's doing
Gameplay-wise, no.
silly damage. I mean, I think it needs to get nerfed. We'll just say that. There's no way it goes live without getting nerfed, I think.
No.
On the council boss, which is where it should shine, obviously. You're just generating way more apparitions, quote, for free. You're getting it. It's your second highest or first highest damaging ability on every single pull. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
I think
it's very silly. I think Pharaoh's just made good points. Why don't Orbit Breaker, which was the balance druid thing, just say, okay, now every 30 vampiric touch ticks, fire out a Twilight Devastation.
Yeah, I mean,
is a long time.
There's a lot of things you could do to change this design, but I don't think they're going to at this point. I think what we have is, and I said this earlier, right? It's going live. We're at the point now where they're not going to be reworking talents before launch. I think they should. I think they should delete this talent, but I think at the same time, it needs to be playable without, because right now it feels like it's kind of cannibalizing our talent tree. It's that good that if you're not playing around it, or it's not working, it's a pretty big hit to our damage if we're tuned around it being that good, right?
This thing is so powerful that it's at least 5% of our single target if you only get one of them on a single target pull. If you have a 5-minute fight and you're playing Dark Ascension, this is 5% of your DPS. If you play Void Form and you get 2 of them, it's closer to 9%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of silly for how little we get to do around it, and how infrequent the thing is. It's still stupidly powerful.
So it's kind of it's also affecting our cooldown choice that they wanted us to be able to choose, right? Because you kind of can't pick Dark Ascension when this talent is here and when it's working the way it is, because it's so much worse with Dark Ascension. Why? You can't not pick Void Form, right?
You can currently pick Dark Ascension. Currently, the best single target build still plays Dark Ascension, and it only gets a single Yogg on an average pull.
Yeah.
The problem is that depending on the fight length, that won't always be the case. If your fight's going to be really short and it's say sub 3 minutes,
3 minutes,
you have to play Void Form. You have to play Void Form on a sub 3-minute fight, because the chance that you don't proc your Idol of Yogg is too high.
But that makes no sense. Looking at the ability, you wouldn't think, oh yeah, it's a 3-minute fight, so I can't pick my 1-minute cooldown. What? That doesn't make it. You would think it's the opposite.
Yeah. I'd agree. There's also the fact that I don't know.
I think honestly, obviously I think a redesign would be great for this talent. I think.
Yeah.
And I put this on the forums, but I think the easiest way they can make this not as much of a problem is kneecap the amount of stacks it takes to proc it, and then kneecap its damage accordingly. I
don't think it's the damage. I think the damage is obviously a big problem, but I don't think that kneecapping the damage is the best way of doing it. I'd much rather kneecap the duration.
I'm saying to do both. I'm saying to.
There is absolutely zero reason this thing exists for longer than 5 seconds at a time, frankly.
Yeah, so I'm saying you get more procs that don't last as long and don't do as much damage. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, ideally, honestly, don't spawn a pet. I don't need this thing spawning next to me to fire the shadow bolts. I'd rather.
That's a design change. That's what I'm saying. We can't reasonable expectations. It's going to be spawning a pet for launch, right? They're not changing that.
Yeah, I guess.
It sucks. This is really shitty. I don't want to sugarcoat this because.
No. Yeah. Of course.
I have some design concerns though, which I would like to actually field about Idol of Yogg-Saron. With the way it currently works, requiring shadowy apparitions to spawn, this will always scale basically equivalent with the number of targets you have.
Yep.
The number
Yes.
you have on single target effectively gets multiplied by 5 if you have 5 targets. What this means is the overall rough percentage of damage that comes from Idol of Yogg-Saron will be the same on single target and on AoE. It does not make any difference in the number of targets you have, it just changes the consistency. Currently, that's really awful because it takes too long to spawn, and we would like it to be reduced in damage, duration, and spawning requirements to make that a lot less of an issue. But even then, this talent will have to be good on single target for it to be good on AoE. Now, if they want it to be a funnel talent, that's fine. They can tune it to be slightly bad on single target, but would allow you to do quite a lot of significant funnel in a dungeon. But the way it works right now for it to be usable on AoE, it's doing 7-8% single target, and that's just too much damage for a thing. At least it's too much damage compared to the other options currently available. As an idol,
Yeah,
8% actually makes sense. It's an impactful amount. It's a lot of damage, but it's also just a passive effect that just triggers randomly. If we had ways of actually scaling up the number of shadowy apparitions we could spawn with targets, this would also not be an issue. So we had we mentioned this earlier, but shadowy insight proccing with no longer RPPM, that would help. We would then get more shadowy apparitions on AoE, and we'd spawn more idols, and you could make the idol weaker. But as it stands right now, with no way of doing that at all, this thing must be good on single target for it to be good on AoE, and I think that is a problem.
Yeah, and it's also Mindsphere isn't working with it. This is another big problem. We only have 2 talents that interact with apparitions, and they're a choice node, basically. And one of them doesn't even give us more spawns of apparitions. So I think even a capstone to a build isn't really how it feels, because there isn't I'm gonna heavily invest in ghosts kind of build right now. There are certain ones that for sure do give you some more ghosts, but there are also ones that give you less, like Mindsphere. So I don't know. It's rough.
Yeah.
It's rough.
I feel like they missed an opportunity by not giving us a line of ghosts. They could have had a spiritual spirit, tormented spirits kind of effect, and then cap it off with a Yogg. So there's a line of 3 things that is just spirit based.
Or hear me out, we delete Idol of Yogg-Saron and replace it with exploding ghosts.
Oh yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
But
even just make every 10th ghost explode, just so we can keep the buff thing and have some variety to it.
We don't want another pet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, we've gone a little over, but the last one is my favorite one to cover. So we have Idol of N'Zoth. So if you guys don't know, this is the kind of quote AoE one, we think, where it's somewhat copied from a corruption effect from BFA, where each one of your dots has a flat chance to apply a debuff on a target. Every time it applies said debuff, it rolls another dice to then see if it should collapse those stacks. And by collapsing, it says, oh, you got your 5th proc, and that also procced the collapse. So now it will tick the 5th one, and then tick the 4th, and 3, and 2, and 1 until it runs out of stacks on some flat tick rate. I forget what it is.
1 second.
1 second. So basically, it's incentivizing you to spread your dots in AoE and do AoE damage around them when it's collapsing. So that's the idol.
This is supposed to be the payoff for putting lots of dots on lots of things.
Yeah. Yeah. The problem... okay, so there's 2 problems that I'll start off with, and you guys can finish it off.
Problem.
The first problem, I think it's a problem. It's currently explodes on your current target. This is still a bug. This has been a bug ever since the talent got added in alpha. But when the explosion is actually happening, in game it goes off of whatever you're currently targeting, not the thing that's actually collapsing. Making it actually a funnel talent, and I don't think this is intended. I think this is just a bug, but they've never actually come out and said it's supposed to work one way or the other. I can't imagine why it wouldn't be exploding on the target that it procs from, but that's kind of point number 1. We either need to get clarification that that's how it's supposed to work, or this bug really needs to get fixed.
And to really drive this home, Pub, what we're saying is on a boss like the Spider Boss, right? We
Yes.
have all the little guys, and they've got N'Zoth on them, and one of them starts ticking down. But if I'm hitting the boss, it's just exploding on the boss. It's not hitting any of the little guys.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's funnel damage, but
It's funnel, but it's at the cost of the cleave it was supposed to be doing.
Right. It doesn't feel like it makes sense. It feels like a massive
It's
bug.
nonsense,
But we don't. Yeah.
If you look at a target like really far away in a key right now, you will just Nazop it and pull it.
Oh yeah,
That's
yeah,
hilarious.
true, true.
Yeah.
And then I think the main problem with this talent is it's clearly like, okay, cool, this is our AoE talent. You know, it could potentially actually be how we want, like, the center of our AoE rotation, even, of saying, oh yeah, in dungeons, you definitely pick N'Zoth because we want to play around it, especially if you want a couple things like Mindseer and Screams of the Void. Yeah, Screams of the Void. To get more dot ticks, because this is not an RPPM effect, it's a flat proc rate. So more dot ticks equals more procs, just straight up.
Yeah.
So like it has a lot of potential to actually be a pretty cool thing to play around in keys and incentivize the dot, spreading that we've been talking about. The problem is when you actually go play with it, it sucks. And this is our biggest, and this is why we were talking about for a long time of like, hey, Blizzard, can we have Mythic Plus to test? We're pretty sure it's going to work this way, but without actually getting into a dungeon where mobs last longer than 10 seconds, we don't know for sure. And now that we've had access to it, basically what the problem with this is, there's no bad luck protection or insurance or whatever you want to say about targets dying. So you could very easily just get foobarred with RNG and a mob gets like 8-9 stacks or whatever and then dies. And then you lost all of that damage. It doesn't instantly explode if the mob has stacks. It doesn't move the stacks to another mob. It just fizzles. So in a Mythic Plus environment, it kind of makes the talent like 10% as good as it should be. Or something.
Yeah, it's really, really bad.
It's awful. You have to roll a chance to get stacked or something, and then you have to roll a chance that they go off.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to do that within the first 2 stacks right now. 1 to 2 stacks. Otherwise, they're not going off before that pack is dead.
Yeah.
And like, to further iterate home the problem with it going off, on dummy testing, and this is dummy testing where the mobs just, like, they're just dummies, I have had stacks expire without going.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Into 9 stacks and expire.
And expire. Yeah.
Like, it's a bit of a piss take, to say the least.
Yeah, it's
It feels
ridiculous.
awful.
Also, if you have no target or a friendly target and it goes off, it deals no damage.
Right, that's what we were
Okay,
saying.
yeah.
The targeting bug is just infuriating in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Jearv, do you remember, or like anyone that's done Mythic Plus, how much like percent-wise this was overall when you were running it?
3%.
3?
Good God, like that's
3%.
3% in a dungeon where it's like it's supposed to be its strong suit. Like it should be. I mean, 10% is always what I was thinking these idols should be.
10, 15, 10, like in a dungeon, if it was doing like the bread and butter thing I expected it to be doing, I was expecting it to be like, if we're pulling packs of 10 mobs constantly, I want this to be like 18% of my damage.
Oh, on that one pack, yeah, at least.
On that one pack, it would be more like 30.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Current
but, like,
numbers, if it worked.
Yeah, like that's what I want. That's
overall.
what I wanted. I wanted it to be the reason I care about putting dots on as many things as possible.
Yeah.
And it just isn't.
And I do think, and I've been talking about this a lot, about like, yeah, we can't really pitch design changes. But I would actually classify this as, it's not really a design change. I think it's just making it work the way that it should. And, it doesn't even need to be in the tooltip. It can just be, that's just what happens. Like when a mob dies and it has stacks, either the stacks just instantly explode or they get moved to another target.
Moving it doesn't work.
Yeah, moving it doesn't work because then you
has
just
to go
have everything with one stack and then it just dies anyway. Like they don't.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You could do both. Yeah, doing just
No,
one wouldn't work.
Doesn't work.
If
you
you,
have
if you
to
did,
make them
if
go
you
off.
did, like, yeah, but if they explode at 1 stack per second, if something ever ends up with 18 stacks on it, it's just and it's already at like 10% health.
Yeah.
They're not gonna go off.
That's fair.
You have to
You're
let them
gonna get, like,
popcorn
3.
when they die.
Well, that's the other thing. And maybe the third mechanic that they should look at is if the stacks expire, meaning you're at the 9 stack, right, and you don't get another proc and it just falls off, it should just start collapsing.
Yeah, yeah. If in a 15 where everything is just like, if you're pulling 5 to 8 mobs constantly and everything is alive all the time, then yeah, it's gonna go off. But as you like get more gear and those keys get easier, or Blizzard tune things differently, like this talent only works when things can live long enough for the off stacks to go off, and they don't always go off.
Which was great on the council
30
fight.
seconds.
Yeah.
I don't believe it was 16% of it overall, though. Unless you
You need
played
about
with
30
like
seconds.
classes that deal no damage.
Well,
Like I don't know, like I can see a world where you don't need to give this the bad luck protection to make it good in really high keys. But in that situation, why not give it the bad luck protection anyway? Because it's not going to make it do more damage in really high keys.
But I think and the point is this is the talent that you should want to pick in Mythic Plus, period. Right? Like not picking this would be weird, I think. And that feels like clearly their goal. And I think all of the idols should have like, it's reasonable to say that like, oh yeah, you should want to run an idol in more than one scenario, but I think each idol should be like, oh no, this is like, I'm the best at it. And like, we just don't have one for AoE, basically.
When you look at a capstone node, ostensibly you should be able to look at the thing and go, I would really want to run that in this.
Yeah.
Right? Even if it has secondary uses, you should be able to look at it and go, this is definitely the thing for this piece of content.
Holy shit, we forgot about where idol is on the tree
positioning.
right now.
I was going to bring that up.
Oh my god.
I mean, I would say it's less a just swap these two idols issue. It's more that all of our idols are like kind of good at or kind of like usable in multiple scenarios, and there's no clear best use case for any of them. And sticking any of them behind pure single target talents just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think, so if you guys don't understand what we're saying, to get to Idol N'Zoth right now, you have to pick either Insidious Ire, which is the Talbodar's legendary we have in Shadowlands, which is a single target talent, pretty much, or Malediction, which is reducing the cooldown of Damnation or Void Torrent. Neither of these really have they don't just have anything to do with Idol N'Zoth whatsoever, which is why we're currently saying it the bottom section of our tree, we need to move a couple things around, or I think the bigger point is add better pathing in the bottom section as well to make it make sense. And because I think things that we would want to take with N'Zoth would be like Mind Devourer and Screams, honestly, wouldn't be that bad. Derangement. Even, I mean, I could even see, I think those are the big ones. So I think, like, can we rework the tree to have that make sense without screwing over the other idols? I think there are a couple things that they could do, but yeah, that's the basis of the problem.
If you just
I think they
swap
should lower
Cthulhu with-
max stacks as well, and if you reach max stacks,
It just explodes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be good too.
The other thing I was going to say about like N'Zoth is it will actually feel good if they go off when the target dies, because like a mob will die and it will still do basically all of its damage. You've lost one target,
One target,
but
yeah.
you're still going to hit most of the pack with it when it dies. And just having the chain cascading of mobs dying will feel really good, especially like in
it'll feel great.
Open world content. You have like 10 mobs dotted and they're all stacking up. You finally kill one, and just cascade all die.
It'll change it from being frustrating to satisfying, just with that one
Yeah.
change, basically.
It's like Soul Flame for Affliction Warlock. It's so fun when that goes off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a lot of good potential, I think, with N'Zoth, but they just need to finish it. It's basically how I would put it.
Needs to be finalized.
And yeah, I think like positioning wise, swapping it with Yogg would be okay, but I think if they did that, I'd also like to see maybe even Screams and Pain of Death swap, and then add more pathing down so that Screams goes into Cthulhu and N'Zoth then. And same thing with Yogg, they could add more pathing too.
Cthulhu.
Yeah, so swapping N'Zoth and Cthulhu and adding like a deterministic element to Cthulhu that connects to the choice and above it of like Damnation and Void Torrent, which is what Vikland has been suggesting, is like a decent way of doing it, because we've always thought of like Void Torrent is just like jumped up Mind Flay. So jumped up Mind Flay having an interaction with the Mind Flay talent makes a
Oh sure. So yeah, you're saying if it was behind Void Torrent, but Void Torrent could proc the Mind Flay tendril, like
Void
that
Torrent
would
just automatically procced one. Just like add that on as well.
Oh yeah, okay, sure.
A direct like reference or callback to the previous talent.
Yeah, I think the only problem I'd have with that is, and obviously this is why this is not so simple, is like I think we like Cthulhu being behind or easy to get Mind Flay, Insanity, and Screams with Cthulhu should be really easy, right?
Yeah, it's like again, like the tree is just like
It's-
the simple swaps aren't going to solve every problem. We're just swapping one big problem for a couple of slightly less important problems.
Yeah, I think
Perks. I'm sorry, did
I was just gonna say, regardless of what they do, the N'Zoth positioning sucks. Like undeniably, it's the worst thing possible.
It's the worst location in the tree for
It's-
it, except for like directly behind Yashaj, which is like that would require a monumental amount of stupidity. But like honestly, it's not even
Yeah.
bad because like we
Yeah.
just pick it then as AOE.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I was about to
um,
say if you swap Cthulhu with Yogg, then N'Zoth with where the Yogg now is. So you put Yogg where Cthulhu currently is,
Yep.
Cthulhu where Yogg currently is, and then Yogg where N'Zoth currently is. You swap Pain of Death with Screams, and then you connect Screams with both Cthulhu and N'Zoth.
Yeah.
I will point out that
Yeah.
that's a node in the 8th row connecting to 2 capstones, and that would be the only case of that across any of the talent trees.
Good.
So you need to put a connection in there, and then you basically shift them all right by 1 except for your charge. And then you'd have all of the ones that are related connected. Pain of Death would be connected to Mindbender, which kind of makes sense because if you're playing Mindbender,
That death
Prism,
stuff,
you're pressing
yeah.
death anyway.
Yep.
Then Screams connects to both Cthulhu and N'Zoth, which makes sense because you're either searing
Problem-
or flaying.
Sail. You can't
Yeah.
do that though, because then the second idol you take is a 1-point investment instead of a 3-point investment.
Oh right, that's why they've done this, haven't they?
Yeah, so that's why this is harder than we think. Yeah. But I think,
That's stupid.
which is why the
I think
feed
we can say that N'Zoth is in a stupid spot without like.
yeah, like that's the
outlining.
that's the core of it.
It's not the problem. The feedback is N'Zoth is in a dumb place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's
does
a
he
lack
go?
of direction on all. There's a lack of direction on all of the idol talents.
They're unfinished is how I would
There
put it, I
being
think.
There being no real answer to the question of where you should put it.
It's definitely disappointing in that respect, just across the board.
Yeah.
And I think it was accurate to call these like in increasing order of needs attention kind of thing. But yeah, they all kind of all a little sad in different respects for sure. So
Okay, so we've been chatting for longer than expected, but I think it's been good.
Yep.
So I'm
We
gonna.
haven't even talked about we haven't even talked about utility. Like,
Oh, God.
Reminds
There's
me,
so-
one last thing, Pop.
All right, all right. Everyone
We just
gets one
mentioned
last
passive
thing.
Points. We just had passive points. What is this? The 7th row with all those 2 points, and except for the one in the middle, and they're all really, really, really bad, except Dark Evangelism.
Oh, this guy.
Just-
Oh yeah.
No, one above, the one
The
just
Maddening
before
Touch row?
the Maddening Touch row.
Yeah, Dark Evangelism should get
That row,
deleted.
that annoys me.
Whispers
That
is
row annoys
lame.
me.
Maddening is
that row,
lame.
yeah, that row is just like it feels like it exists to just gate the tree. Like
I mean,
nothing in there is powerful.
The tree is. I don't want to. I'm not going to beat around the bush, right? Like, there are a lot of things happening in our tree that just aren't finished. Like it's obvious. Like they just ran out of time, and it really sucks. I don't want to beat around the bush. We'll find a way to make it playable in a certain sense, but yeah, it needs. It would be a colossal shame if the tree does not change between now and the end of Dragonflight. Like a massive problem. So like we need, and they even said like they don't want to be, leaving the talent trees here and not touching them. Like they want to be iterating on them inside an expansion, and we really need to hold them to that because this is just frankly not good enough. It's not good enough. Like they're better than this. Blizzard is better at designing stuff than this. I believe that. So
Currently, well, it's partly because of tuning. I basically do my best to avoid anything that has a 2 on it, just to make the pathing easier.
yeah,
So when
Yeah.
I've been trying to make builds recently, all of the best builds literally is just avoid all those 2s because they all kind of suck. And therefore, it's better to be point efficient to get down below. Like, I want my Shadow Flame Prism and I want my Void Torrent, so I'm just going to take the cheapest path possible, which,
yeah.
skip Whispers, skip Maddening. And fortunately, skipping Whispers and taking Mind Melt ends up being really good right now. And then Harness Shadows is terrible, but it ends up just being better because Maddening Touch is even worse, because they nerfed it. It's just a game of like,
Yeah.
but why? Why have you done this?
Yeah. So
Sorry, that was my last point.
that's okay. Does anyone else have any other last points before we call the podcast?
I mean, I'll do questions if it,
All
I
right.
don't mind doing questions and things if like.
We can do questions as well. I just want to end officially for anyone that does want to dip if they don't want to stay for questions. But yeah, Jearv, go ahead.
Kevin is wrong when it comes to insanity generation.
Oh yeah. Oh, thank you so much for reminding me. Actually, holy crap, I forgot. Yeah, look at this guy. You guys can't see this. I'm showing the picture I put in our chat earlier. But yeah, I think someone needs to look at this man. I think something's wrong. He's. Ugh.
No,
Is
I
he
think-
okay?
I think there's a world where powerful spenders and lower insanity generation is fun,
Yikes.
but we are so far away from it that I don't trust them to ever get there. And I'd rather they turn around and go back the other way.
Yeah.
I think with Target right now, it feels fine. I genuinely think it feels fine. It's like
If you
kind of
take-
more
if you
rewarding
take-
again.
If you take every single interactive talent, yes, it does.
But you have to take Void Torrent. You have to take all of the talents that buff your insanity. Like you have to have Mind Devour and Void Torrent and everything else right now, and then it feels fine.
Yeah.
But without that, yeah, it's kind of terrible.
Okay, well, this is the official end of the podcast, so if you were just here to stick around for that, thank you so much for hanging out with us. If you liked the podcast and you thought this was cool and you want to see more of this, either reach out to me on Discord or like throw something in the Shadow Flight channel, whatever it's called. We might do more of these in the future. If there are like other guests we could bring on, like if Vic Lind or Shot wants to come on and talk about things, we could do that, and would have different guests or things like that. Would be down. So.
I get to sit in the comments that yell at you guys instead.
Yeah, exactly. So, and if you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for watching. This is going to be streamed live if we ever do this in the future. And yeah, that's it for the podcast.